Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the show this evening. Tonight's guest, we have a retired imam from the Department of Corrections. The brother did 20 years in the system, and we want to bring him on the show and allow him to say who he is and give the audience why he did what he did and why he's doing what he's doing now. So we welcome Brother Imam Raoof to the show. Welcome to the show, my brother.
Thank you. I guess we have to clarify first.
Yes.
I was the imam who was an employee of the state, and I came in. And I went home every day though.
Right. Well, but it's the same thing. You did time.
But while I was there, I was doing time.
did time.
I understand that. Just for the audience, they
Yeah.
may say, okay, well, was he the imam?
Exactly.
Or was
Exactly.
he the?
Exactly.
Yeah, but I was. I worked as the official title in California, CDCR, California Department of Correction and Rehabilitation, is chaplain.
Right.
It's not an Islamic term, but it's the term that they identify us with. So
Right.
I worked as a chaplain for 20 years at 2 different prisons.
Okay.
I opened up Salinas Valley. We used to call it New Soledad. It's right next to Old Soledad, of course. Salinas Valley State Prison. When they opened that up in 95, beginning of 96,
Okay.
in order to replace those old prisons like Soledad and San Quentin, and they started moving level 4 guys to these new prisons, of
Right,
course, because they were more designed to,
The-
for the program that they had.
Right.
And they had the 180 design yard, and they had a 270 yard.
Okay.
The 180 yard was, I guess the higher custody,
Right.
and the
right.
270 was a little. They all were level 4s,
Right,
but
right.
they had a distinction between those who were on the 180 and those who were on the 270.
Okay.
So I worked there for about 5 years, and then actually the brothers at Solano actually sued the prison system in order to get a full-time chaplain, because all they had is a part-time chaplain. He worked 50% there and 50% next door at CMC,
Okay.
Vacaville, 2 prisons right next to each other, just like Old Soledad and what we call New Soledad.
Okay.
You go down almost the same driveway at Soledad, but here it's right around the corner.
Okay.
So they sued the state of California because they had a population that wanted a full-time chaplain, but they only had a part-time chaplain, half-time chaplain.
Right,
and the chaplain had to split his time between that institution and the other institution, which is more difficult on the chaplain, and then kind of cheats the members from having that representation there
Right.
on a full time. So
Okay.
I came there in 2000, and I stayed there till I retired. And,
So you left Salinas
Salinas
Valley
Yes.
and you went to
Solano, CSP,
Okay.
California
Okay.
State Prison,
Okay.
Solano.
Okay.
That's
Okay.
located in Vacaville.
Okay.
And it was like I didn't, because I started in prison ministry of prison work many years before, maybe 20 years before that, more than 20 years before that, because I came into my first contact with Islam was through the Nation of Islam.
Okay.
And so I was
Okay.
I was a member of the Nation, and we had and at that time they only had 9 prisons, and the closest one to us was San Quentin.
Okay.
And so I started volunteering there when the brothers requested, representation to come from the street, and I would go in with the minister,
Okay.
who was John, we called him John BX at the time,
Right.
but he eventually became Minister John Fakir,
Right. Yes.
and then as Allah would have it, he became the first chaplain that was hired by the state in Northern California.
Right.
When we start getting paid chaplains.
Right. Okay.
And so, I kind of want to give a skeleton kind of outline of how Islam got started in the California Department of Corrections
Right, okay.
and Rehabilitation,
Okay.
as the prison system in California is known.
Okay.
As you know, and as probably everybody knows, America put more people in prisons in any country in the world,
Yes.
including North Korea,
Yes.
China,
Yes.
Russia, all the countries that we dislike,
Yes.
or we are have issues with because of their politics.
Right.
They don't jail as many people as we jail in America.
No, they don't. They really don't.
And California is the state that jails more people than any other state in America.
In America.
They have the biggest prison system.
That's right.
And so.
And that's the same, California.
Yes.
The biggest population in prison is California.
Yes.
Whoa, that's
absolutely.
Yeah.
In fact, the process has been going on now because the prisons were so overcrowded that inmates sued. And the court said, you have to reduce this population because guys are dying because of the conditions in these overcrowded situations. Right. All the prisons that I worked at, the gyms were housing units.
That's right.
And guys were triple bunk.
Yes. Triple bunk.
Yes, a bunk here, a bunk in the middle, a bunk on top. And the guy in the middle, he couldn't.
He had it rough.
So the government said, or the court said, this was cruel and unusual punishment.
That's right. That's right.
Because guys were dying because of these conditions, and so they forced this, the state to reduce the population. The California Department of Corrections to reduce the population. But what I wanted to kind of just hit on a little bit was, because we're the state with the most inmates, we probably have the most Muslims also.
Right.
Estimates are cloudy, but there's somewhere like 10 to 15,000 Muslims are in the system in California. And Islam today is recognized, but it didn't always start off like that.
Right.
So really to understand how Islam got embedded in the prison system in California, we have to look at other states. And this is not the only narrative about this issue, but it is, and I have to say in the beginning, a lot of names I don't know, because there are a lot of people from the outside helped to make this happen. A lot of inmates from the inside, like I say, the guys sued. I know some of the guys who sued, but I don't know all the guys who sued to get me at that Solano. So this is not going to include every name that could be said. But in order to understand how Islam started in California prison, you got to understand what happened in 1942 in Milan, Michigan.
Right. Okay.
Or in the state of, no, actually, it was in the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, who was the leader of the Nation of Islam. May Allah forgive him his sins and magnify his good works.
Right.
He was convicted of not signing up for the draft. This is during World War II. He was already over the age of draft age. He was 45. But anyway, because he taught his population, the members of the Nation of Islam, that we're not going to go and fight in this war. We got a battle here in the United States.
Right, right.
For our rights.
Let me ask you a question. You say he got convicted at age 42?
He was 45.
45? Over the age?
Over the age of draft.
And they still convicted him?
They convicted him.
Astaghfirullah.
And also, there were some other charges too. But anyway, he went to prison. He was the leader of the Nation of Islam, which was relatively new. It started in 1930, and now this another 12 years after it started. And for 7 or 8 of those years, he was going up and down the East Coast trying to form temples, as they were called at that time. So he was convicted, and not only he went to prison, but about 70 to 100 of his male members went to prison also at the same time. So now you got 70 to 100 Muslims in a prison system, the most Muslims that had ever been up to that time in the United States in one place at one time. It was a federal system. It was, and he was in Milan, Michigan. And but as prisons operate, word flows throughout the prison system. Sometimes guys find out what happened in prison sooner than guys know what's happening on the street.
That's a fact. That's a fact.
So in my sense of it, Islam began to move throughout the penal system of the United States at that time. So he stayed in prison for 4 years or 5 years, and he got out in 1946. In 1946, another young man was going to a state prison. His name was Malcolm Little, but he was going to state prison in Massachusetts, and called Charleston State Prison. Malcolm Little, of course, eventually converted to Islam while he was in prison. And if you can believe the film that was put out, a lot of it is, hype about Malcolm. And they tweaked history a little bit. But there was a guy in prison who influenced them. In that, if you saw Spike Lee's film, there was a guy named Bimby who introduced him to Islam.
Right.
At the same time, his brothers and sisters on the street they were from Detroit. And the #1 temple in the Nation of Islam was in Detroit. So they had been influenced by this also, along with his younger brother. And so they began to encourage him to study this brand of Islam that was being propagated by the Nation of Islam. He actually transferred after a couple of years. So in 1946, after 2 years, he actually converted to Islam at another prison as he began to study. And he was probably the most famous convert up to now. We don't know of anybody else who has the same cachet in terms of his name and his recognition, and people who know his history, that people know that he converted to Islam in prison. And so he stayed in prison for about 6 years, 8 years. He got out in 1952, so 1946 to 1952. Then the other important, so that's in Michigan. So we got modern Michigan. No, that was Massachusetts. We got Norfolk Men's Colony in Massachusetts. And the other important place was in 1961, where the son of Elijah Muhammad, he followed his father's teachings to this regard, and he didn't register for the draft. At this time, it's probably was the Korean War that happened in the 50s. So 1960 or 61, Imam, he wasn't Imam Muhammad at that time. He was Wallace Muhammad, the son of Elijah Muhammad.
Right.
He got convicted, and he went to Sandstone, Minnesota, and he spent 3 years there in the prison in Sandstone, Minnesota. And so he also was part of that process that helped to embed Islam in the prison system. How did they get to California? Well, blacks started moving to California in the 50s. My father came out here in 40, I was born in 48. My father came out here in 46, after the war. So blacks started moving to California. Before then, there weren't very many blacks in California. Right. And they were mostly in the South, of course, and on the East Coast. So as blacks started moving to California, of course, the prison population began to grow in the number of blacks. And so blacks became a significant number in the prison system, I think in the 25% range. And because it was such a racist environment, blacks began to have to, they were challenged by that racism that was in the prison. All the guards were white.
Right.
The majority population were white.
Right.
At that time, there weren't very many Hispanics as they are now today. So blacks were trying to band together in order to survive in those racially hostile situations. And so consequently, Islam began to appear and people began to accept Islam in the California prison system. To the extent that they composed a significant number of organized blacks in the prison. Really, Islam was the thing that organized. This is before we had Crips and Bloods and all these other street organizations that all kind of evolved in the same way. They started as organizations to protect you and your communities, or in certain situations where racism or hostilities were around you.
Right.
So they band together, they got themselves a name, they became and many of them had good beginnings, and then they, maybe later on, they kind of moved away from that. But so at any rate, in the prison system, another significant contact was through the temples that were outside. On the outside, Elijah Muhammad had established temples throughout the country. And in California, there were 3 major temples. One in San Diego, there was one called Temple number 8. One in Los Angeles, one in San Francisco, which was Temple number 26, and one in Los Angeles, Temple number 27. And so the men who were in the prisons, who had accepted the teachings of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, they relied on those temples for help, for resources, for volunteers to come even though they weren't recognized by the prison system. But they were such a significant number that accommodation was made for them. But usually the Muslims who came in had to go through the Catholic chaplain or the Protestant chaplain in order to connect with the communities. Significant date was 1963. 1963, one of the leaders of the Muslims was killed in San Quentin on the yard, the adjustment center. He was in the adjustment center. So-called some kind of racial riot broke out, and he ended up being killed. He was the minister, as the titles we used at that time. The minister was the leader. Then we had captains and all these other titles. This is before, of course, we started using Islamic titles. So that minister, he was killed by a guard who says he was hit accidentally. And they were trying to break up this riot between blacks and whites. So being the leader of the Muslim, actually Muslims had got killed before that, but this was so significant because he was the main guy. His cellmate was Eldridge Cleaver, who was also a Muslim at the time. Many people don't know Eldridge Cleaver started when he was in the prison. He was a functioning member of the Nation of Islam.
This is before he became a Black Panther.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So 1963. So when the brother was killed, his name is Booker T.X. Johnson. The X was the X we took like Malcolm X.
Right, right.
T was his middle name. So Booker T.X. Johnson, he was the minister. And so the Muslims demonstrated because they felt like the prison guard had shot him purposely, and so they refused to go to their cells. They were like 70. The news reports, I wasn't there, I wasn't a Muslim at that time. The news reports said that there were 70 Muslims demonstrated on the yard. They refused to go to their cells until they met with the district attorney of Marin County, San Quentin's in Marin County. And they had some other demands. At this time, the Muslims were not recognized as a recognized religion. But they had so many members adhering to this faith that there was a understanding, but they still weren't recognized. And so they end up not getting their demands heard because they absolved the officer for shooting the brother. But it kind of ignited their activism even more. They were already active in trying to demand them to be recognized like these other groups were recognized, and they sometimes had more members than the other religious groups.
Wow.
So they began to demonstrate on the yard, and in 1963, I'll just read you this. In August of 40 San Quentin Muslims gathered on the yard shouting protests against religious persecution. The same month, San Quentin Muslims filed a $39 million lawsuit against San Quentin for being denied the approval to have a place of worship and to have qualified religious guidance. So they went to the courts, just like we still going to courts today for different issues. But so they began to go to the courts, and they began to petition the courts, and they were denied. They were denied up until 1971. I mean, 71, when the court finally ruled in their favor. But before that, going back to the connection between Eldridge Cleaver, he became the leader after Booker T was killed. So he connected with the mosque in Los Angeles because that was the main mosque, even though the mosque in San Francisco was closer. The mosque in Los Angeles was the regional mosque that covered the whole West Coast. And so those leaders tried to involve themselves in their effort to become approved. To no avail at that time, but they kept the paperwork coming against the state. Also in 1963 was the year when John Kennedy was killed. In November. And when Kennedy was killed, of course, Malcolm, who had become the national representative of the Nation of Islam, he made some statements on the death of the president that Elijah Muhammad ordered none of his ministers to make any comments. That was his strategy at that time. Don't say anything about the death of this man, because people loved him, and he felt like this would, to make some statements, negative statements about him, would put the Muslims who are on the street in harm's way,
Right.
as well as the Muslims inside the prison in harm's way. So he said, Malcolm, he made a statement. He thought he was being clever, but the statement caused him to be suspended by Elijah Muhammad. So he was suspended, and there was always political friction inside the nation about the leadership. And some people were jealous of Malcolm. So it turned out, if you go referring back to the movie, because more people know that movie than they know the book that he wrote in other documented evidence. But at any rate, it caused him to be separated from the Nation of Islam. He wasn't able to get back. He was suspended for 90 days from speaking. They reinstated the suspension after the 90 days, and eventually Malcolm left the Nation of Islam. When he left the Nation of Islam, he began to criticize the beliefs of the Nation of Islam, because the Nation of Islam had some, we'll call it, what people consider un-Islamic beliefs in their belief system, They said many good things, but some of those un-Islamic things that were part of the belief system, or at least they were interpreted that way, is what Malcolm began to criticize.
Now, was this before he made his Hajj?
No, after he made his Hajj, he was more explicit, but even before he left for Hajj, because his home had got bombed, and he felt like there were members of the nation who might be involved. And this is before he realized that there was bigger forces, because later on, when he went to Egypt and he began to travel internationally, he began to see that he was being tracked by people whose resources were beyond the Nation of Islam's resources. But so he began to realize that he had some bigger fish that were really trying to survey the situation, and so he began to back up. But he did initially begin to say the Nation of Islam bombed his home, and then he began to criticize. And after he went to Mecca, he came back and he began to say, well, this is the real Islam that he had experienced there. And he called it Orthodox Islam. Orthodox Islam. And so eventually, 2 years later, actually he left at the end of 1963 when this happened. He never came back to the nation, and in 12 months or 13 months he got killed. And but he had traveled to Africa about 5 or 6 times, and he went to Mecca, and he traveled back and forth to Africa, linking up with African leaders, and he began to broaden his scope, and then he was eventually killed. When he was killed, before he was killed, he formed 2 organizations. One an Islamic organization, and another one was a social activist organization called the Organization of African American Unity. And then the Islamic organization was Muslim Mosque Incorporated. So he was going to stay active through these organizations, one Islamic and one that addressed the social problems that were going on in the communities in America. But he began to develop a language for himself, and he began to stress the concept of black nationalism. He began to say that we have to become black nationalists, meaning people who control the communities where we live. It wasn't international in this sense. It was controlling the community. Okay, it was controlling the communities where we live. And so, when he separated from the nation, many people outside the nation and some members inside the nation began to gravitate toward his philosophy. Eldridge Cleaver was one of those. So he began to go toward this concept of black, but also inside black nationalism was the concept of protecting ourselves.
That's right.
With weapons if we had to.
Yes.
So this is where the so-called militant black nationalist movement grew out of the influence that Malcolm had set the stage for. At least there were other leaders who contributed to us, but he was a spark that led. In Eldridge Cleaver, the Black Panther Party, the Deacons for Defense, and many other organizations sprung up based on this inspiration that Malcolm had given. And so the Panthers started a couple years later. In fact, I'm always told by the members who I wasn't in the nation at the time in 1966 when they formed, but they said that Huey and Bobby used to come to the mosque regularly. And then if you see that 10-point program, it's almost the same as what the Muslims want, what the Muslims believe in the back of the Muhammad Speak newspaper, right. Except for it was in their language and based on what their vision for the future. So Eldridge goes, sparks that movement. But in the prison system, in 1970, eventually the Muslims won the right to be recognized. And when they won that right to be recognized, they were able to get their literature in there more easily. They were able to have representation from the street coming in, independent of these other religious organizations that we had to go through before. And eventually, in a couple of years, a few more years, they began to get paid chaplains inside the system.
And this was in what year?
It's 1970.
1970, okay.
And so Elijah Muhammad died in 1975. And when he died, in the prison system in California, 90%, 95% of the inmates were members of the Nation of Islam. People who said they were Muslims, they were members of the Nation of Islam in 1975. And when he died, his son became the leader, and he began to make a transition toward what Malcolm called Orthodox Islam. And so that's the part of the story we'll talk about.
You know, you threw down some science the other day. You really did. You said some things I didn't know nothing about. So you educated me, you know, and I appreciate it, and I know the audience appreciate it. We got to stop right now. You know, we're gonna stop right now, but we're gonna bring the brother back, and we're gonna allow him to come back and give some more of this. We need to be educated on how Islam became Islam in the prison system, where it came from, and who's responsible for it being in the system today. So we want to thank the brother for coming on today. Thanks. We appreciate you coming on, my brother.
Thanks
and
for
inshallah, we're going to have you back on the show and allow you to throw some more science, because very, very good stuff, very good stuff. I appreciate it. So we want to thank you for coming on the show tonight, and we want to come back into your living rooms, your bedrooms, in your homes, and allow you to have some more of this. So we're going to bring the brother back and allow him to give some more science. So thank you for watching the show tonight. Tune in Saturday night at 7 o'clock on Channel 29. We have a live show on the 7th on Channel 76. So at 6:30 on the 7th at 6:30 to 7, we have a live show. Call in and look at the show on the 7th. Thank you and have a good evening.